Okay, I think we can start now.
Sure, thanks.
Okay, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are. My name is John Grajales. I work as a technical specialist at the Department Against Transnational Organized Crime in the Organization of American States. I welcome you all to this webinar on corruption ties with the trafficking in persons. This webinar is the first of a three-part series that seeks to increase our understanding on the nexus between trafficking in persons and serious organized crime. Today, we have three panelists presenting very interesting topics for this webinar. I will introduce them later, but first, I would like to give a brief background on ICAT and the webinar series. As many you may already know, ICAT stands for the Interagency Coordination Group Against Trafficking in Persons. It is a policy forum that was established in 2007 by the United Nations General Assembly to enhance cooperation and coordination among UN agencies and other relevant international organizations for a coordinated and comprehensive approach to preventing and combating trafficking in persons. ICAT provides a platform for, among others, exchange of information, experiences, and good practices in anti-trafficking efforts. Today, we have this webinar as a direct response to this objective. 31 member entities drawn from the United Nations system and other international and regional organizations currently form ICAT. UNODC is the permanent coordinator and hosts the ICAT Secretariat. It works down from the diverse membership and expertise of its members. In 2025, ICAT is co-chaired by UNODC and the OES DTOC, who have set the agenda for the year, guided by 6 annual priorities that aligned with the broad-based multi-year plan of action adopted in December 2020. The webinar series this year responds to the broader effort to build the evidence base on trafficking in persons and covers diverse but very important topics. These are: the first one is corruption ties to trafficking in persons, which is the topic of the webinar that we will be having today with you. The second one is terrorism, firearms, and trafficking in persons, which is planned for July 24, 2025. And lastly, the first one is the webinar on trafficking in persons, cyber and cyber-enabled crime, which will be held on September 25, 2025. The webinar series aims to gather policy recommendations for strengthening the response to trafficking in persons, particularly in relation to its links with other forms of organized crime. The collected recommendations will help shape the future messaging for states and relevant stakeholders. Now, I would like to share with you a few housekeeping rules for this webinar. We will first invite our presenters to share their insights, and afterwards, once the presentations have been concluded, we will then open the floor for discussion. I kindly request you to hold your questions until then and use the raise hand feature in Microsoft Teams for posing your questions in the chat box when the discussion session begins. I would like to inform you that this webinar will be recorded, and the recording will be published on the ICAT website. And now I will introduce our panelists. The first panelist I would like to present Morgan Nicot from the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime. Morgan leads UNODC's knowledge development and innovation efforts covering trafficking in persons and the smuggling of migrants. Morgan, I understand that UNODC is preparing a paper on the role of corruption in trafficking in persons. Could you please share the preliminary findings of your study with us? Additionally, we will appreciate any recommendations that you may have for strengthening to response to the connection between corruption and trafficking in persons. Morgan, you have the floor. Let me stop sharing my presentation so you can share yours.
Thank you very much, John. Indeed. Moving to presenting. checking that my presentation can, it's not appearing yet though. Let me do it again.
Not yet.
Yes. Coming. So thank you for that working?
It is working perfectly.
Perfect. So thank you for this opportunity. Indeed, UNODC has been working on looking at the links between corruption and trafficking, because we saw that there was a clear connection in terms of corruption being an enabler for trafficking in persons, also migrant smuggling, but we're focusing on human trafficking today. We started collecting case law, so judicial decisions, to try to understand how this was being addressed, starting from trafficking in persons cases. But we also saw that it was not actually that available in many jurisdictions. So we also started looking at media report and other literature to better understand the mechanisms and the trends. So we compiled the information on the trends, and we also consulted with a range of experts, two of whom are with us today. So it's really a pleasure to have both Marcelo and Carmela with us as well to share their regional perspectives. The idea would be to have an analytical paper launched towards the end of the year that would both present the trends that we've identified at the global level, really looking at various jurisdictions around the world, and having a sort of roadmap in the type of measures that should be considered in order to prevent corruption in trafficking in persons and address it. Today, I will take this opportunity to address both what we saw in terms of trends, zooming on to certain aspects because of the time we have, and just presenting a sample of recommendations that we've identified and vetted with the experts who were with us about a month ago in this consultation. So moving on to the bigger picture, we identified that actually corruption could be an enabler in trafficking persons in different aspects. It can be an enabler for the acts of trafficking, in particular the recruitment, the transportation, and the transfer of victims of trafficking. It can also be an enabler during the exploitation phase for different types of exploitation, be it for sexual exploitation, forced labor, organ removal, or also forced criminality, scams, for example, online scams. But corruption also kicks in as an obstacle to anti-trafficking efforts, and that can be during the criminal justice proceedings, but also after the criminal justice proceedings. I'm just going to address maybe for the acts themselves very quickly, the type of intersection that we've seen, and typically for transportation across border, for example, what goes together with document fraud is very often enabled by corruption. It's to obtain various types of papers, documents to cross the border. They can be passports, visas, can be work permits, medical records, etc., etc. So that involves a very wide range of potential corrupt public officials. That can be anyone who would be delivering this documentation. So from embassies and consulates, civil registries, health authorities, labor authorities, and so on. We also see that in addition to document fraud, it's also the border crossing itself that may be enabled by corruption, by turning a blind eye, for example, not really examining the validity of the documents. And there, it will be more immigration officials, border officials, potentially military staff as well, who may be involved. And what we also see at that stage is that it can be ad hoc opportunities, like ad hoc bribes, but it can also be, and that's often the case, more of a systematic collusion that goes up the hierarchical chain. Now, when we're moving to the exploitation phase, I'd like to pick two types of exploitation. One would be forced labor, the other one would be sexual exploitation, because they have characteristics that are their own. Of course, and that's directly linked to the opportunities for trafficking persons for forced labor, is that some sectors are more impacted, those where there's high demand for workers, little formal skill needed, seasonal work typically, and short-term, low-pay type of work. You have here, you can think about manufacturing, seasonal fruit picking, for example, extractive industries, etc., etc. And the reason is that there's very often little institutional oversight for this type of job and sectors, and a lack of lobby for workers as well. And that's a typical problem we see in terms of trafficking for forced labor, but these are also creating opportunities for corruption. And here, looking at the type of public officials being involved, the range is pretty large, actually. We have law enforcement, which would be tipping off the traffickers, for example, or derailing investigations, making sure evidence would not be solid enough. Labor inspectors themselves could be under tremendous pressure, and as a result, would be overlooking suspicions, would be falsifying reports, etc., etc. Now, what's interesting as well is that the regulatory authorities themselves, as well as the politicians and policymakers, can really play a very important role there if they are under pressure, if they are corrupted. They could be issuing documentation that says the situation is all right when it is not. They can also actually reform law or block passing laws which would be protecting the workers. So manipulating the procedures, there may be a culture of tolerance and a diversion of resources as well. So that then would come at the systemic level. That's for forced labor. For trafficking for sexual exploitation, here you have some specific characteristics which are, when it comes to law enforcement, typically it would be turning a blind eye, but another level would be aiding and abetting the traffickers. And the next level is really public officials turning into traffickers. And that is something that in the cases we've examined, we've seen, for example, with law enforcement, where also the type of gratification they receive could be sexual services as bribes, so not necessarily only money. And there you would see that there would be several layers of protection in place. We saw also that the influence of uniform or the position of a position of power was really also influencing the trafficking and the victims themselves acting as a means as well to threaten them. Police, parole correction officers, judges, child protection authorities, those that are there to protect the victims and detect the trafficking, once they are corrupt, it's actually removing all the trust the victims would have in the institutions and totally derailing the processes that are supposed to be in place to protect these people. For law enforcement, already mentioned, and it's very similar to what could also happen with other types of exploitation for trafficking in persons. Now, moving on to the risks and patterns, we've also observed some typical risks for corruption that would enable trafficking in persons and some patterns. In terms of patterns, ad hoc versus systemic collusion, as I mentioned at the beginning, solicitation versus offer or extortion. These are very different levels as well. Are they taking an active part? Is it more of a passive type of corruption? That would also be an indication of the level of involvement of the public officials. And whether they are fully part of the trafficking ring or if they happen to be in the outer circles, enabling, turning a blind eye, seeing it as this is not really a crime, I'm just accepting this bribe, I don't want to know what's going on, type of attitude. And yes, exactly, that defines the degree of complicity of the official. On the risks, weak governance is clearly one of the risk indicator for corruption enabling trafficking in persons. We see typically as well in the cases that we found in the description is that it's really perceived as a low risk, high reward involving corruption in order to facilitate any stages of the trafficking in persons. And then there are different other aspects which are just typical to corruption in general, not specific to trafficking in persons, but that also need to be taken into consideration. And wrapping up, I'm just going to propose a few recommendations, just a sample. Of course, the legal framework needs to be in place. There needs to be awareness, full understanding of the risks of the existence of this type of corruption for trafficking persons at the different stages, depending on the sector, etc. So understanding what are the weak points, in terms of territory, in terms of sector, in terms of institution, for example. But many other things can be done. From the prevention side, for example, if you take a risk-based approach, if you understand the vulnerabilities, where are these weak points, then you can target your action. You really need to put in place and process with risk assessment, as well as have processes for this risk management. So risk assessment and risk management processes is very important. And then you also need to put in place controls that will be both internal and external, that can include unannounced inspections, for example, electronic surveillance. Then you can also have organizational measures, again, not only for trafficking, that's for corruption in general, but that would apply to those who would come in contact with victims of trafficking as well. Again, using surveillance can be a part of it, but also rotations of staff, using the 4 eyes principle, not leaving one person processing the arrivals, for example, but always having several people being able to check what's going on, having the vettings of the personnel, managing conflict of interest, also extremely important, randomized assignments so that you're not guaranteed that the person at this post will be the one that would potentially have made arrangements with the traffickers. These are some of the examples. Now moving to detection, there's something that really needs to be done about being able to report, both from those public officials who may have been approached, who may have been corrupted. We need to put in place systems so that they can actually report what happened. We need to incentivize this reporting. So the awareness raising is important. We need also to have watchdogs and reporting channels. That's both for those that will be reporting being at the corruption end, but of course for the victims as well. And coming to the victims, I mentioned it earlier on, we really need to find ways to address the fear they may have of law enforcement corruption. And that can be through neutral, non-police reporting channels, and the range of protection measures that should be extended to victims of trafficking in general, but with keeping in mind the sensitivity to the situation they found themselves in, by actually not being able to trust those services that were supposed to help them. And last point, in terms of investigation and enforcement, so of course there's a whole range of investigation and enforcement that we know when addressing trafficking in persons, but we also need to think that there are alternatives as well to prosecution, and that could be civil litigation or confiscation. And civil litigation is very important when, for example, the judicial system itself is corrupt. There could be actually other ways to remove the corruption element and the corrupt officials from the system, with sanctions, for example. And as we're talking about a crime that is also generating a lot of assets, confiscation remains one of the means that can be very efficient, especially when it comes to corruption in trafficking persons, to reducing or putting an end to this trend and practice. So these are the a few points just to give you a taste of what's coming up. And of course, we'll be sharing the full report once it's published in about 6 months' time. Thank you.
Thank you, Morgan, for the presentation. I mean, looking at your presentation, I can imagine the amount of documents and work that is behind this study. And I think it's very comprehensive and complete. So I guess some of the participants will be having questions, and we will be leaving them by the end of the webinar. Now we will be moving to the next presenter. Our next panelist is Carmela Fonbuena. Carmela, are you there? Can you turn on your camera, please?
Hi, John. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Welcome. Well, Carmela Fonbuena is from the Philippine Center for Investigative Journalists, PCIJ. Carmela is the Executive Director of PCIJ and is also the coordinator of the Journalists Against Corruption, JAC, network. Carmela is a seasoned journalist reporting on issues such as corruption, and she's currently working in some investigations related with this topic. Carmela, could you share your insights on the connection between corruption and trafficking in persons in your region? What's the specific recommendations would you offer so states in particular to effectively address this connection? Carmela, you have the floor. Welcome.
Hello, everyone. Good evening from Manila. Thank you for this opportunity to join this very important conversation. I'll be echoing many of the things that Morgane enumerated in her presentation. So, I'm a journalist from the Philippines, a country that has long struggled with the complex and persistent issue of human trafficking. In the language of stakeholders working in this space, the Philippines is known as a sender country. Many Filipinos have been and continue to be trafficked, both for sexual and labor exploitation and others, often abroad, but also within our borders. So the stories are, as we all know, horrifying. And if you're a journalist in the Philippines, chances are you've covered these stories, you've written about it, and I've done several investigations into trafficking in persons. My first was about the evolution of mail order brides. I'm not sure if many of you are familiar with that one. Before the rise of social media, where foreign men would fly to the Philippines and select their brides from women paraded in front of them. Even then, trafficking was driven by poverty, lack of opportunity, and power imbalance. And over the years, the nature of the crime has evolved. And one of the most disturbing trends that we've been covering now is the online sexual exploitation of children, or OSEC. So I covered this for The Guardian, and what makes OSEC especially cruel, as we all know, is often it happens inside the child's home, abuse streamed online for paying customers, and sometimes with family members involved. Um, the perpetrators' tactics, as we have seen, have become more complex. They've become more agile. There have been significant reforms for sure, but often it feels like the criminal syndicates are always one step ahead of the authorities and policy responses. And as journalists, we focus a lot on the human stories, and we should. The pain, the trauma, the cries for help. We've tried to appeal to the public conscience, but one element often overlooked, both in media and I think in policy, is corruption. Trafficking in person is not an isolated crime, as we are now understanding better. It is deeply intertwined with broader criminal systems. And I really welcome this newer paradigm in anti trafficking work that explicitly recognizes corruption as a central enabler. Because for a journalist who's been covering this story for a long time, sometimes you really ache for solutions. And I feel this is a really good direction. In the Philippines, we've seen in the case of POGOs, this is the Philippine Offshore Gaming Operators, initially presented as legitimate businesses serving gambling markets. Many of these operations were revealed to be fronts for organized criminal activity, including trafficking and cyber scams. POGO compounds became holding sites for trafficked foreign nationals who were deceived, stripped of their passports, and forced into online scam operations. There's physical abuse, there's sexual coercion, and there are threats. All these are common. And we saw that corruption was always present during recruitment. Morgane identified the several stages. During recruitment, officials may accept bribes to issue fake documents or ignore illegal practices. At border checkpoints, for example, corrupt agents may allow trafficked persons to pass freely. In local government, too, officials may provide cover or protection for illegal operations. And in law enforcement, cases may be stalled, investigations could be sabotaged, or evidence can be made to disappear. So what's particularly shocking in the Philippines is the involvement of a mayor who was found to be paying for the electricity bills of a POGO compound, where trafficking and scam operations were allegedly taking place. And despite public outcry and a Senate investigation, no less, she managed to leave the country. And immigration officials have yet to explain to this day how that was allowed. And she eventually returned. This raises urgent questions: who protected her? who failed to act. And if this can happen in one town, can it happen in other towns? And if a mayor can be this powerful, how about other officials? And there have also been real concerns. We just had elections in the Philippines, and there have been real concerns that funds from these operations could be influencing political campaigns. Although we haven't really seen evidence of this, there have been concerns in a lot of places. And this is why serious anti-trafficking response must also definitely target corruption. Concrete recommendations that have been suggested, for example, is one, integrate anti-corruption and anti-trafficking frameworks, as Morgane mentioned, so they're not treated as separate silos. Criminal syndicates don't separate them, so we shouldn't either. In high-risk agencies, again, Morgane mentioned this, like immigration and law enforcement, implement strict vetting, personal rotation, and external oversight. And also very important is the protection of whistleblowers and ensuring that victims are not criminalized. Survivors should have safe channels to report and be empowered to testify. And then pursue international cooperation. For the Philippines, this is very important. Intelligence sharing, joint investigations, and mutual legal assistance are critical. And I've seen good models, including collaboration between the Philippines and Australia, for example, especially in tracking financial flows related to OSEC. And then before I wrap up, allow me to emphasize the vital role of independent oversight and investigative journalism. The investigation of the Philippine Senate into the Pogo-related trafficking was instrumental in exposing crime and corruption. The media played a crucial role amplifying whistleblower accounts, documenting patterns and abuse, and pushing back against denials. I was recently in Vienna for the consultation, and I did hear complaints about how the media can deter, even perhaps sabotage investigations. And this is really unfortunate. It might be a necessary separate conversation altogether. But I think the answer is not in silencing journalists. It will be the wrong response. The right response is to find allies in the media. The answer is ethical, fact-based, investigative reporting. And this is the advocacy. I'd like to mention this is the advocacy of the Journalists Against Corruption, a network of anti-corruption journalists in Southeast Asia that we formed last year in cooperation with the UNODC, because we do recognize the importance of capacitating journalists to play a role in exposing corruption in our respective countries. And I think we can play a big role in Southeast Asia. Trafficking in persons is really a growing concern. It's always been a huge concern, but it's become so complex that we really need to put a lot of attention on the issue. And to make this happen, transparency and access to information are important. Without access to public records, accountability will not be possible. And in the case of Mayor Alice Guo in the Philippines, the public discourse was really robust, largely because government agencies released key information to the media. It wasn't perfect, and there have been concerns about the investigation itself, but it opened up national debate, not just about trafficking, but also about corruption that sustains it. I think that's progress. We have a lot to learn from the entire process that happened in the Senate investigation. We need to confront corruption, and we will not be able to dismantle the system that make trafficking possible if we don't confront it. I think that should be good for now. Thank you for the opportunity to share. We'll be very happy to answer questions if you have any later. Thank you, John.
Thank you, Carmela, for this intervention. I think, totally agree with you. I think journalism is called to be the awareness raisers here on this topic, and people needs to be informed on this topic. As soon as we have people informed on this topic, we will be having more awareness on the importance of fighting against this problem. Thank you so much. We will be doing the question and answer session later on. So please stay with us, and let's move to the next presentation. Now we have Marcelo Colombo. Marcelo is the head of a specialized unit devoted to combating trafficking in persons and smuggling of migrants in Argentina, and coordinator of Red Tram, the Ibero-American Network of Specialized Prosecutors on Trafficking in Persons. Marcelo, I understand that you have conducted a regional case digest analysis that covers the link between corruption and human trafficking. In 10 minutes, may you please share with us your insights on trafficking in persons and corruption and the trends that you have already observed in your work? Additionally, in your opinion, what measures should states take to tackle this connection between corruption and human trafficking? Marcelo, you have the floor.
Well, thank you very much. First of all, good morning to all of you, and it's a pleasure to be part of this first seminar. I will try to answer your questions about what could help in this issue. And first of all, I would like to say that the insights I'm about to share with all of you, and I believe partially answers your questions, stems from my role, as you have said, as a coordinator of a network of Ibero-American trafficking prosecutors, whose name is RETRAM, and is composed by 22 anti-trafficking prosecutors for 22 different countries from our region. The agenda of this network is, of course, quite wide, but one of the purposes that we have is to identify common obstacles between investigations and litigations of cases of trafficking and try to do something about it. And regarding this last objective, after 3 years of working together and planning how to highlight the importance of addressing better the links between human trafficking and corruption, which have encompasses, of course, several judiciary awareness campaigns and institutional statement urging our prosecutors to take this double approach seriously. We are delighted to share with you some findings of a regional investigation launched a few weeks ago, which is in fact a digest of cases that contains successful investigations in terms of convictions obtained in our countries. The idea of this digest of cases was to show how could our judiciaries manage to convict publications that facilitated the process of human trafficking or contribute to the impunity of its perpetrators. Which kind of cases or forms of trafficking were part of these convictions, and which kind of evidence was crucial to get the public officials convicted in this double approach investigations. This research involves 56 cases from 6 different jurisdictions: Argentina, Brazil, Chile, Guatemala, Paraguay, and Peru. And what we have found there is, when it comes for instance, of the type of exploitation, of type of victims, we found out that almost all the convictions involved in this digest of cases involves cases of human trafficking for sexual exploitation. More than 90% of the cases were of this kind of exploitation, with, of course, women as victims, and, of course, vulnerable women as victims as well. And so a preliminary conclusion could be that corruption in our region, or at least the cases we have the opportunity to investigate and litigate, are affecting disproportionately women because they are connected with sexual exploitation cases. But also other preliminary conclusion might be that we need to do it better regarding the detection, the investigation of labor exploitation cases where corruption is involved, because we have none of the cases regarding these two criminal activities. Second, and connected with this sexual exploitation of women, a specific ill practice was identified in several cases, which is the imposition of sexual services to women as bribes, a sort of extortions against them. Public officials get sexual intercourse for free to turn a blind eye towards sexual exploitation of women, and this practice is what we found is that it was like totally naturalized by women and by the victims, who really consider it as a separate crime or even aggravated circumstances of their own exploitation. So what the thing was trying to highlight that and try to gather evidence against perpetrators who is doing this sort of sextortion. Third, Moving now to which kind of ill conduct could be proven in the sentences, we found out that public officials usually cover up the exploitation of women in brothel and protect the pimps, turning a blind eye to their exploitation. In some occasions, we were able to prove bribery, and for that purposes, for that goal, what was really crucial to the investigation was to do a very comprehensive financial investigation to find out the financial flows, and that was and gave us the possibility to connect the pimp with the public officials and the property that they own together. We also identified that in countries where brothels are prohibited, this kind of covering up is easier to prove than countries in where not, because the functioning of a brothel is often quite notorious, and therefore the police section with jurisdiction in the area where the brothel is located is usually intentionally breaking the law, not doing what they are mandated to do, for instance, to stop exploitation and to stop this kind of pimping. And that leads to the following finding, that is that which kind of publications were convicted. No? And in that field, we can see that policemen and inspector in the second place were the main perpetrators or who were convicted in this kind of sentences. And why is that? I may say that policemen and labor exploitators are part of the first ring of protection and the criminal activity. And so it was easier for the investigation to collect direct evidence against them. But for instance, when it comes to judiciary members or other important publications, the obstacles for prosecuting them and convicting them were very important. And we could do it only in a few cases in which we managed to convict, for instance, a mayor or a prosecutor that were involved in the sexual exploitation. Reasons to that, I think that, as I have already said, there's a second ring of covering up the exploitation, in which is very difficult to penetrate and to collect direct evidence against this kind of people who are like pulling the strings behind the scenario, but they're not in the front, they're not physically present in the crime scene. No? So that is an extra difficultation for obtain direct evidence. And also, when it comes to the judiciary, of course, there's a sort of some unacceptable protection sometimes, or some compassion due to a sort of endogamy that is part of this, and judges don't like to be judged by peers, and that also part of the problems that we were facing in moving up in the scale of responsibilities, not of this kind of cases. Then what we found also is that most of the cases involved in these sentences are from the exploitation phase. There were few cases where publications were convicted in the transportation phase or in the recruiting phase. There were most of them from the exploitation phase, and that also can overlap with the obstruction of justice, because we found out in many cases that, for instance, it was common to see that the policeman reporting the legal activity, leaking information regarding raids or telephone tapping, and so they can create like an extra obstacle to the investigation to move forward. Some general problems that we saw also in this try to carry out this research is that we see in a lot of countries that there is a lack of appropriate registration of the cases. Few jurisdictions have the total amount of sentences, and fewer have a specific item in which they discriminate public official conviction. So it was very difficult to access to the information there. Then another problem that we saw in cases is the fear of female victims to report cases. No, there's a free line or a hotline which could help for this when the report is anonymous, and that could be like a tool for overcome this obstacle. But we saw that the fear for the victims, of course, absolutely comprehensive, but it's understandable. But it is one of the problems that we have in the moment to detect the case and to move forward. And also, as I have already said, the cases of labor exploitation in which the defendant has some sort of very good connection with the political environment is were like very difficult to investigate and very difficult to litigate, because there's a sort of complicity in the change of responsibilities, and there's a lot of money there playing a role. Finally, when it comes to the type of evidence and actions to convict publications which show successfully, I can say that telephone tapping and telephone analysis was crucial to gather very good evidence and direct evidence against public officials. Victim testimony, despite the fear I have already told, was of course very important, and it's very important to protect the victims and to grant this victim a secure environment in which she could tell the story without any fear and without any fear of reprisal. Then we also gathered very good evidence with videos, for instance, proving the attendance of the official to the premises of the sexual exploitation place. And this is, again, particularly important in countries where brothels are prohibited, because the mere presence in the premises of a public official, constitutes a good piece of evidence, at least to prove that he's turning a blind eye over the functioning of the place. Then the documents found within the premises after raid was also on the analysis of this document and the correct assessment of them. There's typical document in this kind of brothel or premises of sexual exploitation that is a sort of note that take account of the sexual intercourses of each woman, and in this kind of note it is also expressed most of the time the bribe that is paying for the public official who is like covering up the investigation and covering up the sexual exploitation. And therefore that note is a sort of accountability for the owner about the incomes and expenses of the activity. So this sort of document is very important to prove the connections between the public officials and the PIM. For finally, we encourage our prosecutors to take care for anonymous report, because the hotline for reporting human trafficking cases and connection with corruption is key. Then joint investigations between anti-trafficking and anti-corruption prosecutors working together in the same case and the same investigation generates also very good outcomes for this double angle that has to be taken into account in all investigations. And the last thing is that we need to tackle this double angle investigation at the very beginning of the case, at the very beginning of the investigations. Our research show up that the links between corruption and trafficking also usually appears at the last moment on a criminal process, when the trial is taking place, when the oral debate is taking place, and not in the preliminary investigation. So there's an urge to pay attention to that trend and try to overcome this problem, tackling the double angle approach to this kind of investigation at the earliest stage possible of our criminal process. That's where the sort of trends that we found out, and of course I'm willing to answer any question that can arise. Thank you very much for the possibility.
Gracias, Marcelo. Thank you so much for this presentation. Now, in the meantime, we wait for the questions in the chat of the participants. I will take the liberty, since I'm the moderator, of posing one question for you. And I would like to start with Morgan. And this is quite related with the comment that was doing Marcelo previously, and it's about collecting the information on case law. I see that it's a very difficult task, and there's very few emblematic cases where you can understand what's the problem and understanding what's the challenges. I think from the perspective of the presentation that you did, that was the main challenge of the study that you guys did. How did you tackle that problem? How did you solve the problem? And how you get to analyze such amount of information?
Thank you. Well, have we solved the problem? No. But we try to diversify in different ways. So as UNODC, we do have privileged access to member states, to both the UN Convention on Transnational Organized Crime and the UN Convention Against Corruption. And in that sense, we're also engaged now in a dialogue and in collection of information with all member states, asking about the intersection between organized crime and corruption. So that has allowed us actually to reach out to all member states and ask them to illustrate how they address this connection. So of course, when we talk about organized crime, it's not limited to trafficking in persons, but that was an opportunity. Either through this exercise, very formal exercise that was mandated, resolution-based, etc., we did not get so many cases. So we also pulled the string of all our field offices, the experts we know, trying to connect them also together, reading through what others had written on the topic, which is not so much. We've also reached out to institutions that do have monitoring mechanisms, such as Greta, for example. It's within the Council of Europe. They have a dedicated process to monitor the response of states in the implementation of their regional instrument against trafficking in persons. And a couple of years ago, I believe, in the questionnaire that was put to all states, there was a specific request about information about corruption and cases illustrating this connection. Very little came out as well. I think something that we heard both from Carmela and Marcelo, which is symptomatic of the situation, is that indeed everything is done to kill the evidence. Everything is done to kill the cases. So they don't end up being prosecuted, or they don't end up being successful. So that's why the role of civil society, the role of journalists, the role of platforms like the one Carmela is representing is essential, because otherwise we wouldn't hear of it. Most of the time it doesn't go all the way. So that's the limitation we see, and that's why we need to work together to be able to detect and then address it. That would be my answer. And I hope we will be able to collect more cases in the future, of course.
Thank you so much. Morgan, let me question, what about the emblematic cases? How can we just make more publicity on emblematic cases so we can understand what's the trends and patterns? I think that this is one of the most important things that we have to do. I mean, is knowing what's the trends through the emblematic cases and understanding how authorities are investigating these types of crimes.
So I think the point is to look for good practices also. So we have a case, what was done, what can be done, and inside states and agencies to actually look at what they could reproduce in their own system. And that's really something we're trying to promote also through this work we're doing. The idea would be to accompany states, build case studies with these good practices that we are identifying, and that will be also advertised, let's say, in the study that we will be publishing. So we will the idea of this research paper, this analysis paper, was not to actually come and point at all the dysfunctioning in different jurisdictions. No, it was to look at what good was being done about it, so that then it can also inspire other jurisdictions, other practitioners to embrace this problem and really tackle it with all the means they are, being inspired by what has been done elsewhere.
Thank you, Morgan, for that answer. And now I'll move on to Carmela. Carmela, I think in some cases, or most of the cases, journalists becomes the whistleblowers. They are responsible for collecting information, like verifying the double checking the information, verifying the information, and being that person just throwing all the information into the public. What measures for protecting the whistleblowers are there in place? And definitely, probably there's more to be done on this. What's your insight on that?
Hi, John. Thank you for the question. This is a little bit of a difficult question for me because we've never seen ourselves as whistleblowers, but you're correct. Journalists really play the whistleblower role in many of the stories that are exposed. Often, we also do have interviewees who tell us about what's happening in these cases. And sometimes we cannot name them, so they become anonymous sources. But there are also these instances where we ourselves do the field work, investigate what's happening, looking at the documents, talking to the victims and possible perpetrators. I think this is a very holistic, there needs to be a very holistic response where journalists shouldn't be threatened and the government should be. Access to information is obviously supreme. There's no investigation that can happen if there's no access to information. But also, in the Philippines, it's one of the most dangerous places for journalists. So when journalists are threatened, that creates chilling effect that stops journalists, that can stop journalists from doing their job. So there has to be this environment where journalists are able to do their jobs. And having access to information is just the minimum. There also has to be a climate of justice where any threat to a journalist will be responded to, like the instrumentalities of government should be able to arrest, prosecute even those who threaten, those who kill journalists, because these things happen. A lot of times journalists do not think of it in this manner, like we need a few things in order before we can do our investigations, because we think our job is really to investigate. Not all stories become controversial, not all stories become dangerous, but it's in the middle of these investigations when you find something, when you discover something that you're suddenly surprised that it's bigger than you initially expected. So I think it's there's no easy answer, but the support from government instrumentalities, the basic freedoms that governments need to afford the journalists, those are very important. Essentially, it's rule of law and justice for everybody.
Well, I have a follow-up question for you, but I would like to move first to Marcelo. Marcelo, we in our department we've been working with organized crime in the South American region and the Central American region. I'm sure that for Carmela in the Philippines and for Morgan in with the UNODC, you may agree that this is a very complex situation. Organized crime are involved in many illicit activities. In the region, we have, for instance, illegal mining. And illegal mining has a very close relationship with the child exploitation, women exploitation, sexual exploitation. I mean, it's a huge criminal enterprise. But our main concern on this is this is an illicit activity that generates immense flows of money, illicit money. So our approach on illegal mining, for instance, is trying to identify the financial networks of organized crime. And on this topic, it is important to identify financial networks, deprive the money to the perpetrators of these crimes. In your experience, Marcelo, in the network and in the cases that you have been working on, where's the asset recovery part? How assets are recovered? Are we really identifying the illicit flows related with this crime? Are we doing something to get to the money, to identify really the people that are involved in handling the whole situation? Sometimes when you read those cases, sometimes you realize that the people that is in prison or is prosecuted is the people on the low levels of the organization, but the real people that are taking the money from this are not in the picture of the cases. What's your perspective on that? What have you learned in the work that you've been doing in the network?
Well, so thank you for the answer, for the question. I don't think I have the whole answer for that because it's you have touched a very sensitive and thorny issue, no, regarding investigation. But what I can tell you is that when we investigate the financial flows and we investigate like the financial side of organizations, we usually achieve better outcomes about not only the criminal case and the human trafficking case, because we can reach out those perpetrators who are not in the field of exploitation, no are present physically in the premises of exploitation, and because they are behind the scenario, and for that we need to, first of all, we need to train our investigators. We need to have in our team of investigation financial investigator. That is key and crucial. We need to know how to investigate financial flows. It's not easy to investigate financial flows. It's not for everybody. It's not for every investigator, and we need accountants and we need people who have that specialization about that part of the investigations. We do have that in Argentina. We have some units and some teams who are devoted to investigating this sort of flows and financial flows. The following obstacle that I see in that is when the money is abroad, or money is in another countries, and we need legal cooperation and mutual legal cooperation between countries, and especially when this money is hidden in some sort of paradise which has a lot of secrets and they don't share us without information. So the things that we done here is to investigate very close to the intelligence unit of money laundering, which is in all the countries. We have this special unit that can detect some suspicious flows of money between people, and we're working in that so as to detect the cases from the flow of money and not from the sexual exploitation phase, not trying to and so there's I think that a double way form of dealing with this investigation. First is to try to scale up in the responsibility of the members of the organization. As you have said, most of the cases stop in the lowest part of the chain, and it's very difficult to scale up. One of these difficulties is to find direct evidence against the person who is not involved personally in the exploitation of people, but that is I think it's a thing that we need to solve, because there's an organization that, of course, as all of the organization, has the members, and it has divided the roles of its members, and the members, of course, they are not all in the field exploiting people, because they are like moving the money and thinking of the whole picture of the organization and the whole picture of the crime. So this, when we are speaking about organized crime, we have to think in these terms, in these legal terms also, in which the incrimination and, of course, the prosecution of this kind of may I say, of highest members of the organization it has to be our main goal, and we have to do all our efforts to try to get them and put them in the same level of responsibility, or in a higher level of responsibility than the one who are exploiting the field, no, because they are in the lowest part of the chain. So that's why our experience says that it's not easy, but we need to, of course, take, as Morgan has said, take these good examples as an inspiration for other prosecutors and for other investigators to do this, to investigate properly the financial flows, and to try to achieve the people and the perpetrators who are like hidden, I may say, between the organization, no, and in the organization, and they are not usually prosecuted and convicted.
Thank you. Gracias, Marcelo, for the answer. We have a question from Marianne to Morgan about if you have a newsletter or a page with novelties or trends and good practices for the cases. Morgan, you have already answered the question. Do you have something else to add?
No, but I would also refer to the study that Marcelo was mentioned earlier on. Maybe we can put the link because that's already available. That's for Latin America, if there's specific interest in Latin America. So that's already analysis that's available for a region. Then the global one comes at the end of the year. But indeed, we'll see if we can have an update, a way to update on new cases and trends and good practices in the future. Thanks for the suggestion.
I think we have a little time for another round of questions, if I may. And Morgan, what's next? What's the next step for you guys? I mean, what are you guys planning on doing in the future, and what are the next developments that you have?
It will be taking action, supporting states to better take action, and that can be done at different levels. One is, as some of you may be aware, UNODC is constantly engaging in supporting various agencies around the world at the national level in addressing trafficking in persons, preventing trafficking in persons, as well as corruption. We will look at how we can more systematically address the issue of corruption in our anti-trafficking capacity building activities. That is mostly with law enforcement and the judiciary, but not exclusively. So that's a practice also that we could put there so that we raise awareness systematically on this issue. And also having accompanying the agencies that are most exposed to corruption or to risks of corruption, to being able to conduct these risk assessments and having a mitigation in place in order to prevent it from happening, or at least being able to detect it. So we will reinforce our efforts to bridge that gap, because very often we see that agencies addressing trafficking in persons, the agencies addressing corruption don't necessarily work together and at very different levels. So it's also really a matter of awareness raising. But of course, when it comes to the more problematic issue of systemic corruption, all our programs to tackle corruption are also addressing across the board all the risks that there are, so not systematically only for trafficking in persons, but more broadly, that will continue, obviously. Thank you.
Thank you for the answer. Now, I would like to move to Carmela again, and I will make the question that was sent by my colleague Luciana Paiva. And her question is, have you seen a case where anti-corruption efforts in trafficking worked, and what made it effective?
I think I want to highlight the independent investigation of the Senate, where it exposed the criminality, the patterns. It essentially exposed to the public what's going on in the POGO operations. But I also want to highlight that this was possible because of the amazing subpoena powers of the Senate. It highlights the importance of access to information. It was only possible because the Senate had immense power to practically demand government offices to produce the documents and for elected officials to appear before it and explain what's going on. So it's really the power of information, and until and unless we have access to all these documents, to these personalities, it would be difficult to connect the dots, to connect the people, because it's a syndicate, and we've seen how a lot of personalities work together to move forward this crime. So I think that was effective because of the transparency that we saw in the investigation.
Thank you, Carmela. Now, I will move to the question of Alexandre to Marcelo. And it says, considering that corruption can occur at various levels, including administrative and high-end political institutional levels, what would be the most strategic entry point for addressing corruption linked to human trafficking?
Well, what we need to I think about improving our investigation and of course the detection of cases is to, as I've already said, move up or scale up in the chain of responsibilities, because what we have found is that the people who is usually convicted as perpetrators, as public agents that may be involved in this kind of cases and the kind of human trafficking cases are usually policemen or labor inspectors or inspectors that have the duty to control this sort of premises. So the entry point, I may say, one of the entry point could be to identify a specific and sensitive and dangerous markets. For instance, sexual exploitation, maybe the sex industry, or some enterprises that are very sensitive to labor exploitation, as could, for instance, mining or also agriculture, and try to oversee the financial expansion of the public officials that are in charge of controlling those activities. For instance, if they have to control the activities in labor inspectors or the chief of the labor inspectors whose mandate is to control these agriculture fields in which labor exploitation may occur. They have to be also overseeing the financial increases of the health or of the wealth, sorry, and also try to pay attention specifically to the judiciary, that also is not always investigated, because the judiciary has to be investigated by judges and by prosecutor, and there's a sort of reluctance to do that because of many things. But one of the things that are present there, I think, is sort of endogamy about the connections and the protection that they may have to themselves. So what I would say is the as I have already mentioned, the financial investigation is key to see who is behind the scenario, and the main perpetrators also are behind the scenario. So we have to improve our financial investigation, and if we are able to improve our financial investigation, we'll be able to reach out these higher perpetrators of the crime.
Perfect. And finally, we have a question from my colleague Luciana to all the panelists. And the question is, are there any concrete examples of countries that have made a real progress in this subject, especially in high prevalence countries? Do you have any country to highlight on any good example on this, Morgan?
I wouldn't have an answer actually to give you a specific example of a country there. We do have specific examples in different jurisdictions, but not necessarily embracing fully the problem that is specific to trafficking in persons. So I wouldn't suggest there, but thank you for the question. Great one, but I wouldn't be ready to actually share at this moment. Thank you.
That's a good answer as well, Morgan. And Carmela, do you have any insight on that?
Not specific to corruption, but the international cooperation has merit to it when evidence from the Philippines is shared with the other country, and they're able to prosecute in the other country. I think that's happened between the Philippines and Australia. There's more robust intelligence sharing and evidence sharing. I think that works and will work if more countries could do a similar model.
That's a good point, Carmela. Thank you for that. Marcelo, any insight on that?
I think that when anti-corruption and anti-trafficking prosecutors work together, the outcomes are better, and the anti-corruption prosecutor or investigator, for instance, can deal with some administrative sanctions that the anti-trafficking prosecutor is usually not aware of that. So they can solve things. They can fire, for instance, the publications who is involved in a criminal activity and try to put these publications apart from the investigation. So I think that if I have to choose like a ballot, I would choose this one, working together, anti-trafficking prosecutor and anti-corruption prosecutors.
Well, I think with that answer, we can wrap up this session. I really enjoyed talking to you guys on this topic. One of the things I will ask Mukundi for the next session is making mandatory to bring your coffee, your tea, your mate, whatever, in order to enjoy better this. I think Marcelo has his mate already. I don't have my coffee already, so I need it. So thank you so much for you have your coffee, Morgan. That's good. Next time I'm going to be asking Mukundi to ask everyone to bring his beverage here to share with us. Thank you so much for being with us today. I think this was a great exchange of opinions on this. Our next webinar is going to be on July 24th. If you want to save that date on your calendar so we can start again this discussion, the topic is going to be very interesting. I was recommending to Mike and Macondi having as one of the case examples, one case of in Philippines, Carmela, one case that was done by the Financial Intelligence Unit on how to track the finances of corruption and trafficking in person. That would be a great case for that meeting in particular. So thank you so much. Have a great day. Have a great night wherever you are. And I hope seeing you on the next webinar. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.